Design in Project 202. And so we're going to talk a little bit about learn fast and experiment often. I remember when we were putting these together, this was a big one that the board really wanted to see up here. And so learn fast and experiment often. So some of the tenets there would be, focus teams on outcomes. Anyone can complete a task, but only an experience-driven team can work towards a business metric that is achieving a user goal. Think of everything as an experiment and get really good at running experiments. Devise fast ways to take insights and launch tests, iterate, and then prototype out ideas before spinning up large, expensive teams, right? And so I thought, I don't know how many people are doing prototyping, and actually I found this recently, prototyper.io has a really good chart here, but it's a kind of a renaissance of prototyping tools right now. So if you're trying to create a prototype of something, and when I say prototype, I generally mean kind of a more design-centric prototype, there's a large number of tools, and these tools, in this case, they have them segmented by how interactive are they, what's the fidelity, like how high fidelity, low fidelity, is user testing kind of embedded in the tool? Does it allow wireframing? Does it allow collaboration? So there are tons of tools out there today, and a lot of them are really, really easy to use. So there really is no barrier to creating an experience very quickly that then you could showcase to potential customers or current customers or employees or users. So when we talk about experiment fast, right? So you have these tools and you can create these fast experiences, but what metrics are you really targeting, right? And so that's again one of the key things here is to really understand and have a view of what are you trying to push forward? What are you trying to change? Like what metric are you trying to hit? I'm a big fan of product scorecards. So a lot of times if you're embedded in these product teams, you're going to come up with your own product scorecard. And if you have your whole team kind of dedicated towards solving those challenges, and maybe it's around customer acquisition, activation, user activity level, revenue, referral, retention, right? There's lots of things that you may have in any given product scorecard. And so then you could start to create experiments to try to affect those, right? So if you're trying to increase onboarding, right? Well, you could run a number of experiments to see if it actually affected that metric. And so, earlier we asked about, how often are you getting in front of your users, which is very important, but also how often are you validating and running experiments with your users? And so I would coach you there to find your cadence. I gave them very catchy marketing names. I know a couple companies I worked at had testing Thursdays, but maybe you have a store day, you have a ride-along day, you have jack-in Tuesdays where you're kind of jacking in at the call center, follow me home Fridays. But these are all ways of getting in front of customers on kind of a regular basis and getting your teams excited that these are happening and they know they're coming up and there's some rituals behind it. So I like to say, everything can be solved early in the process. It doesn't have to be a guess. It could be an experiment, right? So a lot of times I feel like these decisions are made in boardrooms or these decisions are made with product teams, but you can create a hypothesis there, but you really shouldn't come up with the end decision, right? That should be an experiment that was run with actual customers, and then that's how you determine if it's the right direction to go or not. So Heath here. Thank you for joining. Let me pull this up real quick. Sorry.
Hey, Jeremy,
yes.
Before you go to that first question,
yes.
Just because I think that this question could actually shape the mindset
yes.
around the next few responses, could you quickly answer what's the difference between UX and CX?
You want to answer it? Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Go for it.
All right, so I think there's actually not really that big a difference. And in fact, different organizations just call them different things. I know when I worked at Travelocity as an example, they felt very strongly that they were creating tools for customers, for travelers. In fact, really, they could have been called traveler experience, but they chose customer experience. I have seen teams that are called employee experience. I have seen teams that are called experience design is another term that a lot of organizations are using as well. I think maybe some organizations feel like user, and there's this whole, in the user experience community, is user a good word to use or not? Because that's what drug or cigarette companies call their customers users, and is that actually is that a positive word to use or not? So I do feel like you're showing a little more empathy by saying whatever it's advisor experience or it's traveler experience. I don't know, anything to add there? Or?
Yeah, I mean, typically when we're just talking about UX, we're treating UX more as the craft of creating the thing. It's kind of where it's morphed to. Project 202 deliberately switched titles and removed the word user from all of our titles because we felt that the inherent nature of the experience requires a human to have an interaction. You don't have to call them out. So it seemed redundant.
Well, how are we going to do robot experience projects? Or not? Is that going to?
It still works. It's still, well, yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, it's fair.
Okay.
Anyway,
yeah.
But so customer experience being more of this kind of holistic experience that someone has when interacting with an entity, like another company or something. Yeah. So it's all the touch points could be encapsulated under that customer experience.
Yeah.
And that's what I was referring to by craft.
Yeah, so you could argue that UX or UI is very like specific to the screen, and that as design, big D design, has grown into itself, like it's really about the holistic experience. So yeah, it's also a bit of a land grab maybe that designers are changing their titles to experience, because I mean that's what you're really working on, right? Like it's the experience is all that matters. Your brand is the experience. All the customer cares about is their interaction. Like they don't that's what they care about. Okay, cool. All right, so Heath. Heath is here to talk about learn fast and experiment often, one of the tenets. He was involved in a large program for a client that has around 2,000 U.S. locations, and I know they are looking to improve services and tools for both the in-store employees and the customer. So this is a kind of a unique experience where there's a customer-facing side and an employee-facing side across these retail locations. And so, you know, we're talking about learn fast, experiment often. So for this project, I feel like there were a series of validation tests, right? And I guess tell me, did you run validation tests? How did that work? What were some of the benefits there?
Yeah, I guess first of all, does everybody here know what a validation test is?
Why don't you level set? What is a validation
So
test?
there's usability testing, right, where you're testing something to understand if it's working for the user. Validation is basically almost the exact same thing, but we refer to validation tests when we're talking about prototypes that we're building before it's production code. And so we use write testing as a method, which I'll talk about here in a minute.
But so usability is if the thing exists today. Validation is I am showing them a design prototype or some type of prototype, and we're validating whether or not that is actually the right experience to commit to code.
It's meeting their needs and doing what they need, yes.
Okay. And so in this case, you ran a series of validation tests?
Well, so with this client, we actually started out and in a usability lab observing another firm's designs. Because they had already hired someone to do it. But what they didn't do, the missing piece of their equation, was they had not informed those designs with qualitative insights. They did not go talk to the users. They did not inform the designs and hypothesis based on deeper understanding. And so that was why we were brought in, was to basically take over. And we observed that, and they did do usability testing on those original concept designs they had, but we quickly pivoted and began doing other prototypes and validation tests to prove out hypotheses that we had to improve the experience in their retail location.
So how do you run a validation test with like a store employee? Like how does that work?
Well, you need to observe what they're doing first, right? Let's understand what the problems are, understand what their needs are, what are they struggling with. Once you understand that, then go back and work with the business team to prioritize those. The things that provide the most business value, the best experience improvement, focus on those things first. Prototype can take a week or less sometimes to build. We take the prototype into the field, back to the original store reps that we met with, and test it with them and say, does this solve the problem that you're struggling with?
So these are built with, and I showed that list of tools up there, these are built with more design tools. So these are not code yet, these are design tools. And you said it takes a week. Is that a lot of time? Is that a large?
A week would be a small prototype, or more extensive prototypes that are longer, maybe have like a sign-up flow or require form fields and other things, may take longer. You're looking at 3 to 4 weeks max. Usually to crank out prototypes, you can do 3 or 4 journeys in that time. 1 week, you can turn around a basic prototype, get it back in the field, test it, make changes, go back, test it again.
And so when you're in the test and you're kind of watching users kind of use that prototype, like what are you doing? And I guess if there's a change or a problem, like how are you addressing that?
Well, you've established a protocol. There's a task you're wanting them to complete. So you're not guiding them through the experience. You're saying, complete task X. And you're not giving them any other guidance. And you allow them to go through that prototype to see if it actually works without guidance. And if it does, then you're pretty close to having something you probably take to production.
Yeah. And how hard is it to update designs in these tools?
Most of these tools are super easy. We predominantly use InVision and Marvel with this client. So InVision prototypes, you can make changes during the session while you're doing the test.
Okay, so you can record any challenges you see, and then like on the fly.
Yeah, you can go from one user to the next and have a different prototype.
Okay.
You can change it that fast. Yeah.
So Chris, I think we have a poll here. Not quite seamless, but close. There we go. How often does your organization use prototypes during product design and development? Oh, good. So those who are saying always, I'm curious, have you set up a cadence? Like, how did you get that kind of built into the process? Is anyone who has an always answer want to mention how they got that kind of built into their process? Yeah, Toby. Or Toby, bring the mic.
So we are in the business of financial software. So the way that we got it built into the process was after a feature has a business case and it's been approved on the roadmap, the UX team is involved very, very early on in the process. When it's at the feature level, before it's broken down into stories or anything, we'll have an ideation session with the developers, with the product owner, all together. We'll come with the problem statement, the persona, and we'll develop a solution together, and then we'll go back and prototype that feature and move on from there.
Yeah, and I guess, and I forgot to mention, a lot of times prototypes could be good to kind of break down things and put them in a backlog, right? I know sometimes the fidelity is of different levels for prototypes, but I feel like it's, if things go well, like you're most of the way there to start breaking things down and putting them into a backlog for a developer, or?
Yeah, it can become a reference for requirements.
Yes.
Right? That's probably how you're using it.
Absolutely. Right? We do high fidelity interactive prototypes, so we can do lower fidelity prototypes or determine if a user study is needed. If we don't have enough use cases from a customer, we'll speak to the customer before we go into ideation and kind of work from there.
Yeah. Can I ask what tool sets you're using, or?
We use Acture.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so in this case, we're talking about this one situation, 2,000 stores, almost 2,000 stores across the U.S. Had these teams used the method before? I mean, we see that actually prototyping, way above gathering customer insights, which is it's great to see. Had these teams used prototyping before, and what did they think about it if they hadn't, or?
No, they were doing most of any prototypes that they did do were really in the context of taking an idea from an executive or a stakeholder and building it and then doing a usability test. That was kind of the extent of how they were engaging at the time. Within the and they were using an external agency to do all of that work. So internally as an organization, they weren't doing anything like this at all when we got engaged.
So kind of rapid iterative prototyping hadn't been really something that they had been.
No, they weren't doing it.
Okay, and when, I guess, so when testing prototypes, so we talked about, you should have a hypothesis and you should be looking to change something, and I know sometimes there are new systems or usability is that metric, but like what are some key ways of tying kind of a validation test or a prototype kind of back to some of those key kind of product scorecards or business metrics?
So there was a method that Jeremy showed earlier, one of our journey maps, and you could see the top half was green and the bottom half was red. That was a sentiment map. And so basically what's happening is everything that drops below that emotional horizon line is bad. So there are things that are friction in the experience. So if you have a journey map, you can easily build a sentiment map based on the journey map to understand kind of where people are having trouble within the experience. You take that data, overlay that with quantitative data based on the usage. If you have the quantitative data, look at the same page, look at what's happening, and often you'll begin to see correlation there. And when you understand that, then you have a metric then you can create to say, okay, we know that maybe the click-through rate on this page is X, and you have an actual percentage, and then you can build a prototype to solve that problem specifically for that issue to remove that friction in the journey.
There's a question that gets sometimes around prototyping, just generally. It's what's the difference between like a design prototype and maybe what people might call a proof of technology or proof of concept?
Well, design prototype's fake, right? It's literally a bunch of static screens that are stitched together by clicking on them. It's like a glorified slideshow with a couple of animations in it. And depending on what tool you're using, the Framer and Acture are a little bit more advanced. You can actually build more in-depth interactions with those. But a proof of concept is we need to prove that this technology actually works. Are we actually pulling data from the back end? And so that's a much more involved process. We try to understand the experience problem that we're solving and solve the problem before we get there. We do include solution architects within the process, so we're not designing something that can't be built. And sometimes they run in parallel.
So one is to prove out the experience is correct, so it's achieving the business metrics, it's achieving the user needs, and the other one is proving out whether the technology can work or not. Okay, cool.
Couple just quick questions that may have a fast response. In an agile environment, when do you do validation testing?
So we'll actually set up our sprints in such a way that we do a design sprint ahead of a standard sprint. And because of that, we're able to do the validation and sprint for the prototype that we're building. Then that output from that, we modify that experience, and that's what feeds into the backlog for the development team. It does strain capacity of the teams a little bit because you're also supporting the developers in sprint, right? So there's production assets and other things that they need, decisions that need to be made. But if you set those teams up the right way, you can get in front of it by validating this before it goes into the sprint where it's being built.
Yeah, I love it when the designs can be kind of chopped up, put into the backlog, because that's what developers want to build great scalable code. They don't want to decide where the button should go or what the feature should look like or interact with, right? And then if the designer teams can get ahead of the development teams, the development team could just fly, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's another question that I thought that I would just create a poll for. So just put it in front of the audience. Can a developer also be a successful UX designer?
So I feel like, from what I've seen in my experience, I feel like they very well could be. That's not what they want to do, right? They want to write great scalable code. Like that's what they're trying to do, and that's what they want to succeed in. And so asking them, which a lot of companies do ask them, like they give them a poorly defined story, and the developer's got to fill in the blanks. And sometimes there's a lot of blanks in there, and I don't know if they actually want to do that.
So I mean, as far as their role and what they're doing for a living, yes. I think there's kind of a nuance there around having developers that also have empathy for the users that they're building the software for is really important. And the more exposure the developers can have to the individuals you're building the tools for, the easier it's going to be going through that design and development process because they're also an advocate. And having the developer as an advocate in partnership with design is really critical.
Cool. Thank you very much, Heath. We have one more principle. Actually, this is the all-encompassing